Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where today we're going to try to finish up chapter 9. This is one of those parts of the Bible that's kind of a sad story, a lot like Cain and Abel, remember? It didn't take too long before we started seeing problems on this earth that God created. But now we're still following Noah, and they had been off the ark now for some time by the time we get to chapter 9, and we're imagining all kinds of things going on. You know, they're probably planting gardens and building houses and exploring around, you know, to try to find different places to live as the family grows. And just kind of keep this in mind because that's the setting for what we're reading today. Now we're going to start at verse 18. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were sons of Noah, and from them the whole earth was populated. So this is, again, it's just kind of establishing the setting. It's reminding us you got these three sons of Noah, and that the job they have is to repopulate the earth, just like with Adam and Eve. That was their commission. We know that some time had passed because this grandson of Noah is mentioned, Canaan, and he being the son of Ham. He comes into this story here that we're about to read, so that's probably why his name is mentioned specifically here in these first couple of verses. Well, let's continue and see what happens next. Verses 20 to 22. Now Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard, but when he drank some of the wine, he became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. Okay, so we're seeing that Noah, now he's got some time to, you know, pursue his hobbies, I guess you could say. And, you know, he lived for 500 years before he built the ark, so I'm sure he knew how to do a few things, including, it describes him as a man of the soil, which probably most people were back then because, you know, you had to grow your own food if you wanted to stay alive. But he decides to plant a vineyard. And I think that's another indication that, you know, things are settling down, because a vineyard takes some while to establish. You know, you don't just plant a seed like with peas or beans or something like that and a few months later you got food. It takes a while to establish a vineyard. So, you know, you get the sense that things are kind of settling down into a normal routine. Anyway, he plants a vineyard, he drinks some of the wine, and he gets drunk. Now, I think a few things to think about here. One is, you know, righteous men, even great men of God, have just human tendencies, and they don't live perfect lives. And, you know, this was a little indiscretion that Noah had. I mean, we can speculate a lot of things about wine. You know, wine is a big thing throughout the Bible, and in most cases it really was very little alcohol content because they used the wine for almost the alcohol within a wine became like an antiseptic, so it was part of their health regime, and they could mix it with water. And for the most part, wine was not didn't contain so much alcohol that you get drunk every time. But for some reason, Noah drinks some fermented wine that's fermented enough so that it puts him into a drunken state. And he basically passes out and doesn't know what's going on as we read on. And I think that, well, the Bible is pretty clear on this whole subject of alcohol and consumption of alcohol. Proverbs 21 in the Old Testament says wine is a mocker and beer is a brawler. Doesn't that sound about right? You know, you think of some bar where guys are drinking beer and brawling. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. That comes from the words of Solomon way back there at that time in the Old Testament. And then in Ephesians, Paul says something similar to the church. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery, instead be filled with the Spirit. That's in the book of Ephesians. So, the Bible is pretty clear on overdoing alcohol. It doesn't, it doesn't say it's wrong to partake of alcoholic beverages, but you just don't want to, lose control of your senses when you drink too much. So this is what happens to Noah, and he's just a human being like all the men in the Bible. All the men that are used by God in the Bible, they have what some people call feet of clay. That just means we're human, we're not perfect, and God uses us because of our faith, not because we live perfect lives. So we kind of see that here. Well, let's continue on and see what happens next. In verse 23, it says that Shem and Japheth took a garment and placed it across their shoulders, and walking backwards, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. Now, we don't have all the exact details of what was going on here, but the one thing that is fairly clear is that both Japheth and Shem had a great deal of respect for their father. And it's interesting here that you've got these two subjects that are mentioned. One of them is shame, nakedness, and the other one is this idea of a covering for that shame. Remember going back to Adam and Eve. When did they first realize they were naked and they had this shame? And what did God do for them? He provided a covering for them. So you see this kind of replaying itself here in this particular event in the life of Noah. But one of the things that we see clearly here is that Japheth and Shem had this respect for their father, and they were protecting his dignity. Now, I think that we have to remember that it says clearly all of this was going on. He was in his tent. In other words, this was a private moment. It's not like, Noah became this alcoholic that had drinking issues. By no means. This was just a temporary indiscretion. And I have a funny feeling he probably never did that again the rest of his life. But this was something that the two sons, Japheth and Shem, dealt with in a respectful way. Now, the next thing that happens, this is where the story gets more and more interesting, in verses 24 and 25. When Noah awoke from his drunkenness and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." There's a few things going on here. One is, it describes Ham as being his youngest son, and there is some maybe disagreement about who was the youngest, and it sort of is based on the way that they're presented in terms of the genealogies. But I think the most common notion is that Ham was the middle son, that Shem was the youngest, and Japheth was the oldest. I guess in a way it's not really that important, but here he is mentioned as being the youngest son. And the other interesting thing is that now Noah is pronouncing this curse upon not Ham, but Ham's son Canaan. I don't really know why it worked out that way, if Canaan had something to do with this indiscretion, or if it was just Noah's way of punishing Ham. But one thing we need to keep in mind at that time and in that culture, and really throughout the Bible, the blessing of the father to the son was a really big thing. That shows up later when we talk about Jacob and Esau, and Jacob, fools his father into giving him the blessing that was supposed to go to Esau. This is something that, we don't have that concept quite so much today, but it was a really big thing to receive a blessing from your father. I mean, we have inheritance, so if you please your parents, they're liable to leave you their money, and that's one way, I guess, that we seek our Father's blessing. It seems to be part of human nature, though, isn't it, that children want to please their father if there's a healthy relationship. You know, when they do something big in sports or do something special, and they want to make sure that daddy sees them and that he's proud of them. So I guess that's kind of a universal principle. But here you have something that's kind of unusual, I think, because I can't think of anywhere else in the Bible where a father curses his son. But what that tells me is whatever this was that happened, and we don't want to invent any kind of stories that, you know, aren't there, but whatever it was very serious, and it was a real offense to Noah, to the point where it resulted in this curse against Canaan, who was Ham's son. So, you know, just some things to keep in mind. I think if you had a friend, I mean somebody that you loved, and you were aware of some indiscretion, some mistake that they made, as a friend, I mean, would you want to go around telling everybody and pointing your finger, look what he did? No, if you're a real friend, if you love that person, you want to keep that quiet. You want to be an encouragement to them. And really that's an instruction we get from Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5:11 as he's talking to the people in Thessalonica. Therefore, he says, encourage one another and build each other up. This should be the attitude that we have towards each other. So I think it brings us to this question, what kind of relationship did Ham have with his father Noah? And we might speculate from, you know, the information that we have here that there was some sort of disrespect. And now that's the interesting thing about having kids, because you can love them as much as you possibly can, but you can never determine whether they're going to love you back, whether you end up with a kid who is rebellious or you know, you just do your best. And Noah, I'm sure, was a good father. You can, again, speculate all kinds of things. Maybe Ham had this thing where he resented the fact that he had to participate in this whole boat building thing, and he missed his old friends back in the previous world. You can speculate all kinds of things like that. But the one thing you can say for certain is that there was something between Ham and his father, some sort of display of disrespect that brought about this curse that came upon him. So, continuing on, it gets more interesting as we go on. We learn some more things. In verses 26 to 27, he also declared, this is Noah, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the servant of Shem. May God expand the territory of Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." So you got the one curse against Ham, but you have blessings for Japheth and Shem. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because these words that Noah spoke to his sons become almost prophetic when we see the things he said about them and how they actually came true as you follow through history. And some of these issues that began here are still with us today. This part of this curse against Ham and the contention between the descendants of Shem and the descendants of Ham, or I should say Canaan, Ham's son. So it gets kind of interesting here, and we're going to elaborate a little bit more on that next time as we go to chapter 10, because we get some more information on this. But basically, we just want to understand the significance of these blessings and this curse. What does he say about Japheth? He says, "May God expand the territory of Japheth." Okay, that's the first blessing for Japheth. Now, I think we mentioned this before. Japheth, each of them becomes the father of many nations. And Japheth becomes the father of the Indo-European and Asian people. I think we had mentioned that before. And you can get into all kinds of studies, genealogy studies, and look at history, some of the ancient historical accounts that sort of blend in with this line of these table of nations is what they call it in the next chapter. And you could probably spend a lifetime figuring all that stuff out. But basically speaking, we can see how this promise to Japheth has really come true, because if you think of the population of the earth today, and you talk about Europeans, you talk about Asians, I would say that probably the bulk of people on this earth today, in terms of numbers, would come under those two headings. Those would have been the descendants of Japheth. So that's interesting. But then he also says that Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem. And what does that mean? It means that in some way Japheth is supported by or benefits from Shem. He dwells in the tents of Shem. And how does that all work out? Well, we know that Shem, as we said before, is the progenitor of the Semitic people, the Jewish people. Now, I think a very small portion, number-wise, of people in this world are Semitic. I don't know, I think I've read just less than 1% of people are Jewish, and whoever else was included in that. It's not a huge percentage of the world population. Okay, we're back to it. I had a slight interruption there with my phone in my hearing aid. I have one of those kind of setups. So anyway, we're talking about Shem and the fact that he had this promise given to him, that Japheth would benefit from Shem. He would dwell in the tents of Shem. Well, what does that mean? Spiritually speaking, Shem becomes the progenitor of the children of Israel, who are God's chosen people. And it's also interesting in this same verse that we just read, where he starts out by saying, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem." God is the God of Shem. Now, what's that all about? Wasn't he also the God of Ham and Japheth too? Well, I think what that is referring to is the fact that the descendants of Shem become God's chosen people. And later on, we get this promise to Abraham, who is a descendant of Shem, that through him the whole world would be blessed. And that's exactly what happens, because it was through the line of Abraham that Christ comes into the world. And when Christ came into the world and died for us, he died for everyone. And in that sense, the whole world is benefited by the house of Shem. So isn't that interesting? And this is really all becomes like a prophetic statement as Noah is blessing his sons. And then it mentions once again that Canaan might be his servant. So we have the blessings for Shem and Japheth, and this reiteration of this curse against Canaan. And it's interesting how that all worked out too when we talk about Canaan. And why is the focus on Canaan here? Because there were other sons, Shem, Ham, they all had many sons. Well, it turns out that Canaan becomes the father of the Canaanites. And as you follow the story of Israel when they go into the Promised Land, the chief opposition that they had was from the descendants of Canaan. So you can kind of see how this pattern begins way back then in this little episode with Noah and Ham and his son Canaan, and how it carries itself all the way through history, even until today, because really this anti-Semitic spirit that we have in the world today is kind of the result of that little family feud that began way back there then. So how do we wrap all this up? This is one of those, it's kind of a sad story, kind of interesting. It has some prophetic elements in it. But what can we conclude from this? Well, I think one thing that we already said was that we all make mistakes. We look at Noah and we said, well, that wasn't a happy episode in his life, and I'm sure it was one of those things. Probably everybody has something in their life that they can point to and say, man, I wish I'd never done that. But that's part of being human, and it wasn't that God was looking for a perfect person to serve him. So that's one thing that we can learn. The other thing we can learn is that little things can become big things. And as we said, this whole seed that was planted between the descendants of Canaan and the descendants of Shem is something that is even still with us today as we look at all the unrest in the Middle East. But our good word for the day, and as we wrap things up here, our good word for the day is actually the last two verses in this chapter, verses 28 and 29. Because it sort of gives a summary of Noah's life. It says that after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. So he lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. So this number 350 is significant, and I think it reminds us of the fact that when you obey God, when you walk a life of obedience, you end up in a place of blessing. Talk about Noah blessing his sons. Well, we all seek God's blessing in our lives. And I'm thinking 350 years after this big adventure on the boat, and he's able to see his descendants, and he's able to watch them grow. And 350 years, imagine how many how many people there could be. We were talking about that relative to the pre-flood world, how there could have been millions of people at the end of those 1600 years. There could have been, easily 1 million people by the time Noah dies, after 350 years of watching his descendants grow. So I think he ends up in this wonderful place of blessing. And just one little interesting aside here. Noah lives, for 350 years. And if you do the math and you read the genealogies, you find out that Abraham was born only 2 years after Noah dies. So I think we were talking earlier about how did Moses know all the stuff that was going on with Adam and Eve. Well, Noah could have actually, I don't know if their lives overlapped between Adam and Noah, but they could have. They would have been very, very close. So Noah theoretically could have gotten this information directly from Adam, these stories, and brought all that information with him through the flood and in the ark through the flood. And of course we know by the time of Abraham, they definitely had writing, the cuneiform writing during that time. So all that could have been recorded and written. So it didn't have to go through a lot of people in order for it to, that information to have traveled its way down through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and eventually to Moses, who records it all. So that's interesting too. I don't know. I hope that doesn't get too boring for you, but it's fascinating if you're into all these details, how it all really does fit together. But in spite of the difficulties, and as a result of his obedience, Noah's life ends with, I would say, this great blessing, where he's able to see everything that God promised him, where he's able to look back and say, man, because I lived this life of obedience, I literally changed the course of human history. Well, I mean, it was God who did it, but he uses Noah as an instrument to accomplish that. And now Noah can stand there, I guess it kind of in the same way that Adam and Eve did, and watch their descendants grow. See all of his descendants grow into this world that we live in today. And, that's something we're going to talk a little bit about next time as we get to chapter 10. So anyway, a little bit of sadness in this story, but also an encouraging story when we think about what it means to live a life of obedience. And I guess you could say also the fruits from disobedience are always pretty clear as well. So these are some timeless principles that we see here. And I hope it's been a blessing to you. And it's going to be interesting next time as we look at this chapter 10 and the table of nations and all kinds of interesting things going on there. So I hope I see you next time. Hope you can join us on Gen Z Bible class.